everybody and welcome. My name is Jack Butler. Welcome to the Wisdom of the World show. I'm really excited today to be here with my guest Steve Mcintosh. Steve is a thinker, writer, and has had a variety of successful careers as an entrepreneur, lawyer and business executive. And we're here today to talk about his recent book, Evolution's Purpose. So let's jump right in. Tell us, what is this book about?
Well, first, thanks for having me on your show, Jack.
Good
it's
to
a pleasure to do this interview with you.
Thank you.
In the book, I carefully argue, using the best of what science has shown us, that now that the full panoply of development that's been occurring for the last 13 billion years in the universe, once we begin to feel and see that we're part of that we can feel that within us.
Yes.
In a sense, our purposes are its purposes, because we embody every level of emergence that's occurred since the Big Bang in our very being.
Wow.
We can begin to understand that our quest to make the world a better place, to improve the human condition, is an expression, really, of the interests of evolution overall. So in the book, without being too idealistic or new age, with being rational and scientific, I try to show that the very science, the facts of science and history themselves point to evolution moving toward directions of intrinsic value. Okay, and intrinsic value is not conceived of in a kind of a pre-modern Platonic idea of infinite, eternal forms. The understanding of value is a realist conception, in the sense that value is not merely subjective, but value requires an evolution within people's consciousness to be able to see it. So in other words, the quality of the world is there. There is dynamic quality in the world apart from our perception of it. But in order to connect with this quality, our consciousness has to evolve to a level where we can see it. So as consciousness evolves through the biological level and then at the human level, it's able to recognize the dynamic quality of the universe in greater and greater degrees and with more depth. And so that's how we overcome a simply objective model of value, while at the same time showing that it's not merely subjective. Nature has value. We're both finders of value and makers of value. And value kind of takes a subjective appreciation as well as objective quality to be able to see.
So can I just pick up on a couple of things you said there? You said our purpose, our individual purpose, is if you like, the same as an expression of this overall world evolving.
Right.
What does that mean for someone who's sitting there thinking, well, I'm trying to work out my life purpose? Because I guess we all have that kind of question.
Sure. Well, a big way of framing intrinsic value and making it, one step less abstract, right, is to talk about it in terms of the beautiful, the true, and the good. And beauty, truth, and goodness are kind of a triad of values that have been recognized by philosophers and sages, East and West, for the last 2,500 years at least. And this triad of values I use as a kind of a rubric to talk about value, because in some ways the beautiful, the true, and the good are like the primary values. Just like red, green, and blue dots on your computer screen can make all the colors in the spectrum, the beautiful, the true, and the good are kind of like a way of conceiving of values in a similar way like color. In the sense that there are, of course, millions of values and ways that we can make things better, or comparative excellence in the world. But according to thinkers more accomplished than me, these three values in some ways capture the best of all the values and do serve as a way of understanding value in a way that's in between the specifics of day-to-day life and a kind of a philosophically abstract idea like intrinsic value or dynamic quality in the universe. So in terms of how that applies, if people think about the things that are beautiful and true and good for them, if they understand that these are like forms of spiritual nutrition, like the beautiful, the true, and the good actually serve as spiritual experience, or even the comprehensible elements of the divine. And so understanding that these values, that no matter where you are in the spectrum of development of your own spirituality or consciousness, there's something that's beautiful and something that's true and something that's good for you already. So getting in touch with those values in your life and understanding that those values that you perceive are related to the larger purpose of the universe. In other words, our role, being humans, is to act as agents of evolution. And we begin to understand that evolution is this movement toward intrinsic value, despite setbacks and horrors of the world and regressions. Humans have evolved their culture and their consciousness by trying to improve their conditions. And this improvement of the conditions can be understood through this rubric of the beautiful, the true, and the good. But humans have improved their conditions most dramatically in history when they've improved their definition of improvement itself. In other words, when an emergence of a new set of values, a new octave of the beautiful, the true, and the good has emerged. So, for example, you can see how the value of goodness has evolved through stages in human history. And one of the ways of charting that is by looking at the circle of those worthy of moral consideration. So, for example, at the tribal kind of Stone Age level of human development, those worthy of moral consideration are your blood kin, right? And those who are of other tribes are generally regarded as the enemy and not worthy of moral consideration. And then an emergence occurs in history, which we recognize as the world's great religions, right? Starting around the 5th century BC. The circle of those worthy of moral consideration, they find a device for drawing that circle wider to include more than one type of blood kin, but those who were of the same religion deserve moral consideration, right? Those who were not part of the faith are the infidels, but it allows a much greater geographical area for social solidarity and organization, right? And that's a major step forward. Even though we condemn ethnocentric morality today, at one time in history it was a major innovation that improved the human condition. Right?
And would it be fair to say that there are some people in the world today who are still in an ethnocentric morality?
Oh, indeed. The majority of the world makes meaning using a pre-modern mythic worldview of various kinds, East and West. Even in the United States, probably 30% of the people have a pre-modern conception of truth and morality. And that's not necessarily bad. In other words, every one of these levels, whether it's tribal or traditional, have really important evolutionary achievements that we need to carry forward and build on. We can't just sort of vanquish these earlier cultures entirely, although we'd like to prune away the scaffolding that represents pathology, which we can see all over the world. But just to complete the analogy of the evolution of morality, there's a major step forward beginning with the enlightenment of a nation-centric morality, where a nation can have people of different religions who are still worthy of moral consideration. We can see that today in the American media lamenting the outsourcing of jobs to China. Right? Americans are more morally worthy than Chinese, which is implied by the politics of that. And then in progressive circles, we see another emergence where we move beyond either nation-centric or ethnocentric conceptions of morality, where we develop a kind of a world-centric morality, where indeed all sentient beings are worthy of moral consideration, and perhaps at an equal level. And so that's an example of how value evolves as it becomes more inclusive. These worldviews define improvement more inclusively. Just quickly, another example of this is the evolution of the value of truth by stages, right? So what's true or what's real is conceived at the Stone Age level, generally through various forms of animistic religion, kind of a magical thinking where the world is enchanted. And that's not all wrong. I mean, there's a big, I think we've made strides recently within progressive culture of rediscovering some important aspects of indigenous wisdom. But obviously magical thinking has its limitations, right? And then we can see in history how that there's a move with the traditional emergence of the great religions to a kind of a mythical conception of reality. And while that's still mythical, it represents a kind of a grasp on reality that has a little bit more purchase, a little bit more inclusive of what's real than the magical. Then with the Enlightenment, we have a scientific rational conception of reality, which improves the human condition in dramatic ways with things like scientific medicine, and technology, although there's lots of bad that comes with that, and we can talk about that element of evolution if you like. But just continuing the analogy, we've now, with the emergence of a progressive understanding of truth, the best of that has, builds on a kind of scientific rational, but it also includes a more holistic understanding. It's not just materialistic. Right? So you can see it, for example, in holistic medicine, considers more than the physical body. It considers the emotions. It considers the spiritual well-being. Yeah. And so beauty, truth, and goodness do evolve. I mean, it's harder to make the case for beauty, but at least truth and goodness are pretty solidly established. You'd have to be a pretty extreme relativist to claim that humanity has not improved our conditions in meaningful ways. And in the book, I argue for progress, but not in a linear way, not in a Victorian immature conception that's biased with ethnocentric notions of cultural superiority, but that does recognize a vertical dimension in the evolution of consciousness that we can reclaim while still maintaining the evolutionary achievements of progressive conceptions that do recognize equality and do recognize that values are relative to a degree. So reclaiming evolutionary progress without falling into the mistakes of the past is an important task of the book, Evolution's Purpose.
And just so people are clear, using the word consciousness, you know, consciousness evolving, raising consciousness, and it seems from what you're saying that there are a number of things that can be understood under the definition that you're using of consciousness. I just wonder if you could make that a bit more explicit for someone who's like, what is this consciousness thing?
Right. I mean, there's lots of technical definitions of consciousness. You know, science has tried to reduce it to the brain states, or at least, you know, the latest fashions in neurology. But my definition of consciousness is pretty commonsensical in the sense that it's our feelings, our thoughts, our intentions, our memory, our sense of self, our subjective presence, the inside of what it's like to be us, you know, and how other people see us in terms of, you know, I see your body, but I also kind of know your personality, and, you know, that you are a unique person. It's part of your subjective presence that I'm knowing, and not just your physical appearance. So consciousness is what people think it is. It's their mind, their internal awareness of themselves and the world, and so this element of reality itself evolves. And this is an important kind of foundation of the work of Evolution's Purpose, and indeed integral philosophy in general, is that, for example, animals have consciousness, obviously. They can learn and they can grow in their experience. But for an animal to evolve its consciousness in any significant way, it has to evolve its biology. In other words, its consciousness evolves in lockstep with its biology. But humans have demonstrated the remarkable ability to evolve our consciousness in ways that don't depend upon our biological evolution. Like our consciousness may require our brains, you know, in general, for its activation. Whatever evolution the human brain may have gone through in the last 10,000 years, this by itself can't explain the significant evolution of consciousness that's occurred in the same amount of time. In other words, we have, you know, the size of our language, our conceptual ability, our ability to, you know, recognize aesthetic dimensions, our sense of smell, or our ability to recognize animal tracks may be much less than our ancestors. But overall, the content of our mental lives are much larger, and it's you know, the straightforward explanation is that we've got a network effect through culture. We're standing on the shoulders of the achievements of our ancestors in history. We've been able to carry forward the gains, really, of thousands of years. And all those gains are in our minds now, We're relying on, just like, you know, the evolution of biology proceeds by steps, and the higher forms of organization are using the accomplishments of the earlier levels in a kind of a chain or an ecosystem. Same thing's going on in consciousness. In other words, the achievements of these levels of human development are, you know, when we get it right, necessarily being used. So, for example, we can see it in culture, whereby modernism, you know, wealthy, prosperous, modernist economies generally have only shown themselves to be stable where they're growing out of a foundation of relatively healthy traditional consciousness. Like the traditional culture provides a sense of fair play, honesty, decency, respect for legal authority, If those values are not in place and functioning as an evolutionary achievement, attempts to develop modernism often collapse back into corruption. Because people don't have those values. And so, for example, in Japan, one of the reasons that it was really able to develop one of the first non-Western, homegrown forms of a prosperous modern economy is that their traditional stage was extremely well developed. They were never colonized. They had 200 years of self-imposed isolation and refinement. And so, you know, the beauty of traditional Japanese culture is a testimony to how these stages build on themselves in the evolution of consciousness and culture.
Yes, very good. One of the things you talk about a bit in the book is the current paradigm that science operates within. I'm just wondering if you can talk to that a little bit, because it seems that you're saying that some things we can now see weren't possible to see in, say, Darwin's day.
Sure.
But have we actually updated the paradigm of science to acknowledge some of the more recent kind of findings and emergences within scientific research?
Well, you know, this is an area of contention, right? There are a lot of writers who have decried the current kind of reality frame that dominates the institutional culture of science, as well as, you know, major parts of the intellectual mainstream media, and this is the paradigm of materialism, right? That the world is simply physical, and that any spiritual conception is sort of a pre-modern mythic idea, and that if we're grown-ups, right, we no longer believe in that mythic stuff, right?
So this is like Dawkins territory.
Right. Now, part of the contention is that some have argued, look, the vast majority of scientists give no thought to the metaphysics of materialism, right? They're just doing their science, and, you know, they may not be interested in spirituality, but it doesn't, whether they have any conception of spirit or not is really irrelevant to the larger culture and work of science. But then there's others who point to the popularity, for example, in the New York Times, right? The new atheists are portrayed as cultural heroes, right? And there's definitely a surge in culture of those who would have us believe that if you're an intellectual, you're a materialist, right? And the right thinking way to conceive of reality is a no-nonsense materialistic conception, right? And that does have an impact on our educational system, on our you know, sense of well-being as a society, as our government. Even though our politicians are you know, claim to be Christians and are not influenced by that. I think one of the biggest problems...
Well, that would be a US thing, I guess, because in the UK...
you don't have to claim to be a Christian to be elected.
I don't think that would help you, actually.
Actually, it hurts. Okay, all right. Well, okay. Regardless of the politics, one of the things that I'm arguing in Evolution's Purpose is that a materialistic metaphysics, a material reality frame, that I mean, it's definitely extra scientific to say that the universe is simply material, right? Science doesn't prove that. It's just an assumption that goes with many of the popularizers of science, or, for example, the institutions of science, like Scientific American magazine, right? It's a litmus test. If you are talking about anything extra-physical, you don't get published in Scientific American, right? You're just kind of seen as outside the pale. And indeed, those who questioned the scientific assumptions of pure naturalism, many of them have received intense scorn and wrath from the larger community.
And what do you mean by naturalism?
Naturalism is a synonym for materialism. In other words, that everything's material, meaning that there's nothing supernatural. Right? Everything's natural, and that explains everything, right? And I think that going beyond a mythic conception of reality and just trying to explain as much as possible using natural or physical causes, that was an important stepping stone for science. That's not all wrong, right? I mean, we've been able to achieve a lot by trying to bracket out anything non-physical, right? So it's not as if, again, we're trying to vanquish or erase these earlier levels of cultural development. We're trying to build on them. But we can also see how we've gotten to the point now in our understanding of evolution, which is more than a scientific theory. In other words, evolution is a creation story of our age. And we can't help but use a creation story, even if we're unaware of it, just like we're using the foundation of this building. Right? I mean, we wouldn't be sitting here if there wasn't a foundation. And you can't really have a coherent worldview unless you have some notion of your origins. And so evolution is the story of our origins, and it has symbolic and cultural value that extends way beyond you know, its scientific utility. And we've gotten to the point now where everything that's been discovered, all of the scientific discoveries of cosmological evolution since the Big Bang, you know, biological evolution since the emergence of life, and the evolution of human history, you know, culture and consciousness since the emergence of humans, that even though these are distinct types of evolution, even though they can't be conflated, they are representing a larger process of becoming. They're all part of the universe's unfolding. And the data that we have before us for these forms of development are now breaking out of the mold of materialism. Right? Materialism can't hold these facts. Right? So just like evolution as an understanding of the universe helped dissolve a mythic worldview, right? The creation story of 6 days in the early Earth is clearly wrong, as shown by evolution. But ironically, perhaps, those very same facts are having an equal effect now on a materialistic worldview. The idea that it's all an accident or just randomly occurring without any larger meaning or purpose, that's just as mythical as the idea that the world was created in 6 days. And the facts of evolution themselves show that. It becomes self-evident once you have an understanding of it. And that's why Evolution's Purpose is a kind of a philosophy book, because just like it's pure empirical data, without a philosophy attaches no matter what you do, right? And right now, in popular culture, the philosophy that is clearly attached to these facts, as popularized by writers such as Dawkins, is that that evolution is somehow a proof of materialism, or evolution has, the facts of evolution have demolished the kind of a spiritual or religious viewpoint. But I show in Evolution's Purpose how a more appropriate, updated philosophy that corresponds better with these scientific facts is one that can recognize that evolution has been producing intrinsic value. That quality is what's emerging as well as complexity, right? As well, and it's not, the world's just not becoming more intricate. It's becoming more beautiful, more true, and more good, partially through us, right? Us as agents of evolution. And so, anyway, despite, you know, the horrors of evolution, the horrors of history, despite all the setbacks, despite all the pathologies that have come along with the progress, in the book I carefully argue how we can recognize evolution's generation of value, and how this generation of value itself points to both progress and purpose. So we're now at the point where the very facts of evolution, through science and history that are now before us, really demonstrate that an estimate or a framing of evolution that claims it to be purely naturalistic and purely kind of a brute force material development caused by physical causation alone, that these very facts require an updated philosophy. And the job of this updated philosophy is to take this amazing achievement of science and bringing us all this incredible information about our origins, and showing that that there is intrinsic value that's being produced along the way. That evolution is generating value, and it's not just a subjective impression or an anthropocentric, you know, notion that because it's valuable to us, we think it's objectively valuable, right? Indeed, the value has been building on itself for 13 billion years, and anything that aims at value consistently, even though some of that value might be accidental or epiphenomenal, the fact that it's been building on value and that we can feel it within ourselves, that we, in a sense, as agents of evolution, can know from the inside that evolution is inherently purposeful and teleological, that is, it's aiming at something, and that this aiming at value need not be conceived purely in a theistic conception. In other words, understanding that evolution is making progress and that it's demonstrating purpose doesn't mean that we have to explain that through the notion of God, right? I mean, it may very well be produced by a conscious creator, or it could be the result of just a creative principle or a natural teleology that we can't understand. So in the book, the philosophy doesn't require any kind of beliefs on the part of the reader, but it does demonstrate that mythic conceptions of our origin have been, you know, transcended, as well as materialistic or purely naturalistic conceptions have also been transcended.
So if someone's listening to this and they're saying, okay, so you're saying that the current paradigm of science needs to be updated because of facts that we now know, can you just give your best examples of what those facts are for someone who's not a scientist, just to say, okay, well, if that were true, then I get that the paradigm is... Right.
Well, I mean, part of it is that if we understand that the evolution of human culture and the consciousness that goes with it is real evolution, even though it's not simply biological or cosmological, but the reason that it's part of that same sequence of development, even though it's a distinct domain, just like life is distinct from matter, they both evolve, human history is distinct from biology, it's building on biology. If we didn't have animal bodies, we wouldn't be evolving our consciousness and culture. And there wouldn't be animal bodies if there weren't atoms and molecules and physics and chemistry and a planet for us to live on, right? Yes. So the fact that we, in our very bodies, embody all the evolutionary achievements since the Big Bang, yes, is a way of understanding how our evolution is real evolution, right? But when we begin to understand that our evolution is about values, it's about the beautiful, the true, and the good, it's about improving the human condition, we have to acknowledge the degree of value realism and the fact that consciousness, as a non-physical reality, can't be reduced to our biology. It is a causal factor. Consciousness is helping to produce evolution, and consciousness can't be explained from a purely materialistic point of view, no matter how many intellectuals might try to argue in that way. You know, again, there are people who are materialist fundamentalists, yes, just like there are people who are religious fundamentalists, yes, right? And there's no argument, there's no persuasive sense of making a point that's going to persuade a fundamentalist of any kind. Yes. So if your identity is invested in the universe being purely material, yes, and you know, the idea of something enchanted or spiritual is anathema to your sense of self, yes, there's no argument that's going to dislodge you from that, yes, unless you're an extraordinarily open-minded person, right? Got it. So in academia, these debates rage, but it's not, the parties are talking past each other, right? Richard Dawkins is never going to be convinced, right, that there's more to the universe than matter in motion, right? Yes. And again, his job is to try to, in culture, is to stand at a particular place in history and to try to help people leave behind a mythic worldview and, yes, adopt a more scientific, rational worldview. Yes. And to that extent, you know, that's positive evolution. Yes. But we don't want to just drag people into the scientific worldview and leave them there, yes, because that's a kind of a more advanced but nevertheless still mythic conception of reality based on what we know now. Yes. So we can point to consciousness, we can point to the reality of values, we can point to the efficacious effect that these realities have on evolution and their essentially non-physical nature. And we can also point to other arguments that have been made really for years that even though the evolution of the universe since the Big Bang can be explained by physics and chemistry, the Big Bang itself remains extremely mysterious. Yes. Certainly momentous. Where it came from is not explained, although, you know, again, some have argued, mostly through hand-waving, that it just kind of comes from nothing, but, you know, that's not really an explanation. Yes. Right? Likewise, the emergence of life, you know, the appearance of DNA, and before the appearance of reproducing life, is not explained. Despite the investment of billions of dollars in over 50 years, scientists who have been trying to recreate the conditions of the early Earth have not been able to produce life from non-life. They haven't been able to reproduce that emergence. Yes. And again, these arguments have been well argued. You know, materialistic science is kind of armed to the teeth with arguments in their fight with the mythic, yes, conception. They're trying to fight the good fight, yeah, of overcoming superstition, yeah, right, and yeah, mythic beliefs. Yes. But you know, in this process, many of them have become fundamentalists themselves. Yes. And one of the benefits of being able to break out of a materialistic paradigm is it allows us to understand ourselves in the universe more completely. Like at the beginning of our talk, we talked about how people can find their purpose, yes, you know, through understanding that that which is beautiful or true or good to them is sort of what their purpose is in being here, right? Yes. And so whatever their work, however mundane their tasks in the world, if they understand that making those tasks spiritual in a way, making, yes, those meaningful, yes, is to really bring out the gift of the beautiful, the true, and the good, you know, to others. That to the extent that we bring these values into the world by expressing them, teaching them, serving with them to others, that these very expressions of the beautiful, the true, and the good are the rungs of the ladder of our own ascent. You know, that our consciousness evolves, we become more developed in our character, yes, indeed in our spirituality, as we channel and metabolize these aspects of the universe, which are really, you know, we're coming to see more clearly by understanding, in a sense, the spiritual message of evolution. Yeah. That we don't need to think of spirit in mystical terms, although, you know, we don't need to rule out mysticism either. We can understand that morality, right? That the searching for truth. These are spiritual experiences. They're spiritual practices, right? Yes. So even Dawkins, in his attempt to understand the truth of evolution, is doing a spiritual practice, although he wouldn't admit to it, because he's trying to come out with the truth. He's trying, yes, to find the truth. And to that extent, the fact that he is implicitly acknowledging a transcendent dimension of truth means that, the atheism's kind of naive in the sense that, they're relying on spiritual realities even as they deny them.
Yeah. So what would it mean if everyone adopted, or everyone or a majority of people adopted this idea that, yes, there is a purpose to evolution, and I am part of that unfolding purpose?
Sure. Well, the book Evolution's Purpose is part of a larger movement, best described as integral philosophy, or the integral evolutionary worldview. And although this is relatively small at this point, it is an international movement. There are people interested in this way of thinking in Europe and South America. It's growing quite rapidly here in North America.
And what is relatively small? What does that look like?
Who knows? Maybe 100,000 people, are interested in this. But it's definitely an avant-garde intellectual movement. But it has larger implications. It's not just some subculture that's not going anywhere, at least we claim. And so this integral evolutionary movement has arisen partially through philosophy, just like modernism during the Enlightenment arose primarily through new philosophy and new forms of science. And this movement is really looking at evolution and seeing how the story of evolution is a profound spiritual teaching that has real significance for the organization and progress of human society. And so this worldview is emerging now on the horizon of history, right? It's kind of emerging in a way beyond the best of progressive culture, while many people within the evolutionary worldview are coming from progressive roots. In some ways, it's because of their dissatisfaction with the limitations of progressive culture, that they're emerging into this new way of seeing that is able to include the values of previous stages of development more inclusively, right? Rather than just being countercultural and rejecting the establishment, rejecting some of the achievements of our civilization. This evolutionary perspective can begin to reclaim some of the important achievements and strive for a higher synthesis of culture that can better include all the different forms of culture in the world. And it's certainly beyond multiculturalism. It's an understanding of the evolution of consciousness and culture that can reclaim, as I said earlier, a vertical dimension of development. In other words, we're able to recognize comparative excellence without falling back onto ethnocentric notions of cultural superiority. And so if we want to make the world a better place, as it always has been made better, is through cultural evolution. The evolutionary worldview promises to be the next significant historical step in this timeline of worldviews and values development. It's a new octave of the beautiful, the true, and the good, and it's able to achieve this expanded conception of reality by better integrating, as I said, the value sets that have emerged in history instead of just being isolated from those. So what would it be like if the world adopted the evolutionary worldview? Well, first of all, we can't, one of the fallacies of a kind of a postmodern or progressive worldview is that there's this expectation that there's going to be a miraculous awakening, that we're all just going to come together and realize that we're all one people. Right? That some event like 2012 or something is going to trigger a worldwide spiritual renaissance that's going to solve the world's problems. The idea that the world is going to wake up in a kind of a miraculous spiritual renaissance is a beautiful notion, and if the world could really wake up in that way, it would solve many of the world's problems. But although we're all alive here in the year 2012, not all of us live in the same time in history. Right? The evolution of consciousness and culture is spread out over the last 5,000 years of history, right? Where many people in the world are making meaning using reality frames that have changed very little in the last 1,000 years. And so we can't just sort of expect that people who are living in a traditional worldview are going to become, progressive and postmodern overnight. We have to have evolution. And so part of the way that occurs is that people are drawn to new truths, new ideals of morality, new forms of culture, when they have gotten to a point where their level of culture is complete enough to provide a platform for its own transcendence. And yet at the same time, people are moved to improve their conditions because of current problems. So there's sort of a push and a pull. The push of problematic life conditions and the pull of the transcendent forms of value that promise a better way. And what the evolutionary worldview attempts to do is show this whole spectrum of evolution, this whole internal cultural ecosystem, if you will. And by doing this, we're hoping that we can find ways of gently persuading people to evolve their own consciousness by making these other worldviews less threatening. The tension, the dialectical tension that exists between traditionalism and modernism, or modernism and postmodernism, this has come about through cultural evolution, right? In other words, the way evolution works at every level is first there's differentiation, and then there's integration.
Yes.
Right? So we're at a point in history, here in the United States, for example, there are people decry the polarity of our politics and the gridlock.
Right.
And this has partially occurred as the progressive postmodern stage of culture has pushed off against and moved away from the modernist mainstream.
Yeah.
And this has created, in a sense, where traditionalism has moved into more conservative positions, right?
Yes.
So there's been a sort of a pulling apart of the culture.
Yes.
And what this evolutionary perspective, this evolutionary frame promises is that we can describe and begin to carve out a place, a cultural location where what an integration of these different forms of culture look like, right? How we can't just vanquish modernism, we can't just vanquish traditionalism. Those cultures aren't going away. They're going to be around and in some ways vital
Yes.
in history for at least our lifetimes and certainly probably throughout the 21st century.
Yeah.
So understanding that one of the best ways that we can help achieve the goals of progressive postmodernism, for example, is by demonstrating what a transcendence of postmodernism looks like, right? By showing a new form of integration that can more ably include these values without, by being able to tease apart the enduring values, like I said, honesty, decency,
Yes.
respect for authority. Those very values are attached directly to pathologies, like, bias, ethnocentrism, racism,
Yes.
right? And so the idea that we're just going to get rid of that entire culture is a mistaken conception. It's a misunderstanding how evolution works. If we can tease apart the dignities from the disasters, so to speak,
Yes.
this is one of the ways that we can help kind of increase the fluidity of evolution within these cultural stages, right? We can help people who are pre-modern become more effectively modern without needing to kind of completely let go of their traditional roots. We can help people move, be less threatened by a progressive postmodern culture when they see that postmodernism isn't trying to simply get rid of modernism or get rid of markets or
Yes.
kind of have some regression to local farmers market economies,
yeah.
right? Yeah. So if we can have more empathy between these stages of development without trying to glue the pieces back together, right? If we can recognize that the way forward represents an integration that is transcendent, these are very abstract terms. But if you investigate integral philosophy and read evolution's purpose, you'll see with specificity exactly what this program looks like. And so, just like during the first Enlightenment, about
Yes.
350 years ago, one of the most significant ways that the human condition was improved was through the advent of scientific medicine, right? I mean, even though scientific medicine has its limitations, it certainly improved the human
Yes.
condition in all kinds of amazing
Lifespan,
ways. Yeah. And so one of the promises of this evolutionary worldview, if it indeed is an authentic historical development that will one day be the equivalent of these other significant worldviews, is that it has the opportunity to kind of heal history. Like so many of the world's problems are historical wounds that keep being recapitulated in every generation. And if we can begin to understand values in these interior dimensions of development in consciousness and culture more effectively, then we'll be able to work to, again, gently persuade the evolution of consciousness. Because when we look at it, we look at the world's problems, we can see that almost every problem in the world can be understood at least partially as a problem of consciousness, right? Whether it's, global warming or nuclear proliferation or poverty or hunger or disease. If we could evolve the consciousness, it's either creating or failing to prevent these global problems, we'd be improving the human condition in dramatic ways.
Yes.
And because many of these problems are turning out to be intractable because they have this interior dimension that we haven't been able to get at yet.
Yes.
Just like, human disease, until we had scientific medicine, we couldn't get at the interiors of the body. We're now getting into the interiors of the mind through this understanding of values and evolution that can help us heal history and raise consciousness and solve problems through that method.
Yes. So just specifically on one of those issues, climate change, nuclear, gross inequality.
Right.
If you were sitting in politics or involved in some way in an NGO or someone who's kind of fighting that cause as that's their day-to-day concern and mission. What's the advice?
Right. Well, it doesn't fit into a soundbite.
Yes.
Right? In other words, how you can use this understanding of the evolution of values and consciousness.
Yes.
That it is opening up a new frontier of understanding.
Yes.
But there is some complexity to it.
Yes.
There is a learning curve.
Yes.
But I would recommend that people who are working to improve the world on the ground take advantage of this new philosophical technology, if you will. This new way of understanding human nature and seeing how human nature itself evolves. And that if we can begin to reclaim this vertical dimension, it's like the Renaissance. One of the things that happened is people got a sense of perspective. That was one of the external markers of this emergence of a new kind of consciousness. And the same thing is happening with this evolutionary perspective in the sense that it is giving us a new dimension of understanding that is this vertical dimension of development. And that doesn't mean that people who have less developed forms of consciousness are less intrinsically valuable. Or again, one of the ways we're able to get this understanding in a moral way is to appreciate that levels of development don't equate with intrinsic worth. And in some ways, those who are living in earlier forms of culture have very important contributions that have yet to be made, right?
Yes.
And so we're not going to look down on them or be condescending to people who are less developed in their culture. But when we begin to understand this internal cultural ecosystem, this allows us to solve problems, in a way that we haven't been able to solve them before. And so one of the ways that we're trying to apply this is through a new think tank, a nonprofit social policy foundation that I'm founding with a variety of other accomplished evolutionaries. It's called the Institute for Cultural Evolution. And we're just beginning, but we have detailed campaigns. The first one is to try to ameliorate climate change. Again, it's not as if we have the answer. It's a wicked problem.
Yes.
But it's also a problem of consciousness.
Yes.
Many of the people who resist or deny the problem are doing so for ideological reasons.
Yes.
And if we can begin to reduce the conflict that exists, that's sort of pinning people in place regarding this issue, we believe that we can help make progress in the area of building political will to do something about it.
Yes.
Right? And so, another one would be political gridlock. Right? The culture war is responsible for many of the political dilemmas here in the United States, and we believe this perspective on the evolution of consciousness can have significant impact on culture war issues where ideologies are otherwise frozen.
Yes.
Again, if we demonstrate what a synthesis or an integration of these different poles look like, that could go a long way toward healing the battles of the culture war.
Yeah. So if people want to know more about what you're talking about, if people want to get hold of the book, where can you signpost them to?
Well, Evolution's Purpose, the full title is Evolution's Purpose, an integral interpretation of the scientific story of our origins. It's available on Amazon, of course, Barnes & Noble, bookstores. Okay. But the headquarters for my work is on SteveMcintosh.com, right?
Yeah.
And Macintosh is MCINTOSH, SteveMcintosh.com.
No,
and there I have video and audio interviews, excerpts from the book, an occasional blog, and news of what's going on with the integral worldview in general, and my work in particular.
Yeah.
So SteveMcintosh.com.
SteveMcintosh.com. Well, I want to thank you for spending the time with me here today. I've really enjoyed our conversation.
Thank you, Jack. I appreciate your interest in my work, and I know we're in this together.
You're welcome. Yeah. Thanks for your contribution to culture. This is an important
and to you
thing
too.
moving forward.
Okay.
So,
all right.
Thanks very much.
Thanks a lot.
Cheers.
Okay.